Tonight, we're diving into one of the most unbelievable true stories you've probably never heard. The tale of a man who didn't just con the rich, he sold the Eiffel Tower. Twice. This is the story of Victor Lustig, a master of deception, a ghost in a suit, and the man who outwitted millionaires, mobsters, and even the FBI. So before we all get nice and comfortable, take a moment, if you haven't already, to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know where you're watching from. Now, let's step into the world of charm, confidence, and illusion, and meet the man who pulled off the greatest con of the 20th century. In the early 20th century, at a time when Europe was still recovering from war and grappling with change, one man traveled across the continent with an elegant suit, a silver tongue, and a wallet full of lies. His name was Victor Lustig, and he wasn't just another petty swindler. He was a master of deception, a con artist so smooth, so polished, that people often didn't realize they'd been duped until long after he disappeared. Lustig had many names. He spoke 5 languages fluently. He could charm dukes, disarm detectives, and talk his way out of handcuffs. To some, he was Count Lustig, a refined European aristocrat with connections in every capital. To others, he was a shrewd businessman, always pursuing the next big deal. In reality, he was neither. He was a phantom, a man who lived in the margins, made a fortune on illusion, and pulled off scams so audacious they sounded like fiction. His most famous? Selling the Eiffel Tower. Not once. Twice. But before that, Lustig had built his reputation across 2 continents. He was born in Austria-Hungary in 1890, in what is now the Czech Republic. Little is known about his childhood, but he quickly learned the art of confidence. By his 20s, he had already scammed his way through hotels and gambling halls in Europe, posing as a wealthy nobleman or international investor. He learned early that presentation was everything. If you acted like you belonged, most people would never question your authority. He took his talents across the Atlantic, just as America was entering the roaring 1920s. Wall Street was booming. Prohibition had created black markets, and the public's hunger for fast money made them vulnerable to slick-talking men like Lustig. One of his earliest and most successful schemes involved a device he called the money box. It looked like a simple wooden box with levers and gears inside. He claimed it could print real US bills, using a process that took 6 hours per note. And to prove it, he'd insert a genuine $100 bill on one end, then, after a delay, extract another real bill from the other side. The catch? The machine only worked a limited number of times, because the chemicals involved were unstable. Of course, the real trick was that the box didn't make money. Lustig simply had a few real bills hidden inside. By the time the mark realized they'd been conned, Lustig was long gone, with their cash in hand. He sold dozens of these boxes. Each time, he changed names, hotels, cities. His scams were so elegant that many victims didn't even report them, too embarrassed to admit they'd been fooled. But Victor Lustig wasn't content to sell fake machines or swindle gangsters out of pocket change. He wanted something bigger. Something legendary. And in the spring of 1925, as Paris buzzed with post-war glamour, and the Eiffel Tower stood tall over the city, Lustig saw the perfect opportunity. The French government was facing economic trouble. Infrastructure needed repair. Metal was scarce. The Eiffel Tower, once a marvel of engineering, had become expensive to maintain and was beginning to rust. Newspapers speculated about its future. Was it worth saving? Or would the city be better off dismantling it? To Lustig, that speculation wasn't just news, it was inspiration. He wouldn't just scam someone out of money. He would sell the Eiffel Tower. Paris, 1925. The Eiffel Tower stood tall above the city, its iron frame glinting in the sunlight, casting a long shadow over the Seine. Tourists still visited, but the once revolutionary monument was no longer a symbol of progress. It was beginning to look more like a problem. Built in 1889 for the World's Fair, the Eiffel Tower had outlived its original purpose. It was expensive to maintain, unpopular with some Parisians, and rusting faster than officials could repair it. In newspapers and cafes, people whispered about the cost of keeping it standing. Some called it an eyesore. Others a burden. Victor Lustig read those whispers like a blueprint. If he could convince someone, just one person, that the French government had secretly decided to dismantle the Eiffel Tower and sell it for scrap metal, he could orchestrate one of the greatest cons in history. And so, the plan was born. Lustig checked into the Hotel de Crillon, one of the most luxurious hotels in Paris, posing as a deputy director from the Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs. He printed official-looking documents, forged government stationery, and even had a chauffeur-driven car. Appearance was everything. He became the perfect image of a mid-level bureaucrat, too unimportant to draw headlines, but just important enough to be trusted. Then he contacted 5 of the most prominent scrap metal dealers in the city. Each one received a formal invitation to a confidential government meeting regarding a major infrastructure project. The meeting, of course, would be held in a private salon at the Hotel de Crillon. When the businessmen arrived, they were greeted by Lustig, polished, diplomatic, and entirely in character. He explained the situation with calm authority. The Eiffel Tower, he told them, had become too expensive to maintain. The city had secretly decided to dismantle it. But because the move would be politically controversial, the sale of the metal was to be handled quietly, offered only to a select few, under strict confidentiality. The dealers nodded, intrigued. They were used to big deals, but this was different. This was historic. Lustig kept the meeting short, emphasized secrecy, and told them the government would accept bids within a few days. There was no time to delay. Then came the most important part of any con, choosing the right mark. Among the 5 dealers was André Poisson, a younger man, relatively new to the scrap metal trade. Eager to prove himself. Ambitious, but unsure. Exactly the kind of person Lustig could manipulate. Over the next few days, Lustig met privately with Poisson. He complimented him, confided in him, and subtly implied that other bidders were more connected, more experienced. Poisson began to feel anxious. He needed an edge. That's when Lustig made his second move, the bait within the bait. He let it slip that a small bribe might help smooth the deal with higher officials. Poisson, now desperate to win the contract and unaware he was being played, agreed. He handed over a sizable cash bribe, along with a payment for the Eiffel Tower scrap rights. It was done. The money was in Lustig's hands. Within hours, Victor Lustig and his accomplice had boarded a train to Vienna, with a suitcase full of francs and a grin that stretched across the border. Back in Paris, Poisson waited. Days passed. No word came. Finally, he reached out to the ministry. There had been no sale. There had been no plan to dismantle the Eiffel Tower. There had been no Victor Lustig. When André Poisson finally realized he'd been swindled, humiliation sank in faster than the shock. He had just handed over a small fortune, not just in cash, but in pride. He hadn't simply lost money. He'd been outclassed, tricked by a man who wore fine suits, spoke like a diplomat, and vanished without a trace. But the con was so flawless, so expertly staged, that Poisson couldn't bring himself to go to the police. How could he? If the story got out that he'd paid a bribe and bought the Eiffel Tower from a man who wasn't even a government official, he'd become a laughingstock, not just in his industry, but across France. His reputation would be ruined. So, he said nothing. No police report. No complaint. Just quiet shame. And that silence was exactly what Victor Lustig had counted on. In Vienna, Lustig celebrated with his partner, Dapper Dan Collins, an American gangster who often played the muscle in Lustig's cons. They stayed in lavish hotels, dined in the finest restaurants, and spent freely. They were ghosts to the authorities, faces that passed through cities and vanished just as fast. But Lustig wasn't finished. He watched the Paris newspapers closely in the days and weeks following the con, waiting for word to break. But there was nothing. No headlines. No arrest warrant. No public outcry. Just silence. And so, against all logic, he returned to Paris. To do it again. Only a true master of the long con would dare such a move. Most criminals would have disappeared forever, living comfortably on what they'd stolen. But Lustig was a gambler at heart, not at the casino, but at the table of human psychology. He believed the same setup could work twice. And maybe, with a few adjustments, it could. Back at the Hotel de Krillin, he resumed his role as the discreet government official. He printed a new set of forged documents, and once again invited prominent scrap dealers to a confidential meeting regarding the secret dismantling of the Eiffel Tower. The setup was the same: urgency, formality, and just enough mystery to make it irresistible. But this time, something went wrong. One of the dealers, suspicious of the secrecy, reached out to a contact within the government. Questions were asked. Alarms were triggered. And just like that, the illusion cracked. By the time authorities arrived at the hotel, Lustig was gone, slipping once more out of the city with the practiced ease of a magician. No arrest. No capture. Just another clean getaway. Word of the con finally reached the public. And this time, it did make the newspapers. The man who had sold the Eiffel Tower, not once, but twice, was suddenly infamous. To some, he was a criminal. To others, a legend. Paris was stunned. The international press picked up the story. Journalists couldn't believe it was true. But it was. The details were too precise. The witnesses too shaken. And the elegance of the deception too brilliant to ignore. But Lustig wasn't in Europe anymore. He had returned to the United States, where opportunity waited, and danger followed close behind. And there, in the land of gangsters and G-men, he would soon find himself in deeper waters than ever before. After vanishing from Paris for the second time, Victor Lustig resurfaced across the Atlantic, in the land where fortunes rose fast and trust fell even faster, the United States. The year was 1926. America was roaring. The economy was booming. Cities gleamed with promise. Bootleggers, bankers, and Broadway stars lived side by side in a country drunk on prosperity and greed. And where greed thrived, so did men like Lustig. But Victor Lustig wasn't just a con artist now. He was a legend. The man who sold the Eiffel Tower. Twice. His name was whispered in criminal circles. Law enforcement barely knew his face. He moved like smoke, spoke like royalty, and stole like an artist. And now, he was about to execute his most profitable scam yet, one that would take him to the top of America's most wanted list and right into the crosshairs of Al Capone himself. But first, he went back to an old favorite, the money printing box. This scam had made him rich before, and now, with America's obsession with wealth and speed, it worked better than ever. Dressed in a fine three-piece suit, with a well-oiled backstory and a box that hummed mysteriously, Lustig worked his way from state to state, selling hope to the greedy. He would demonstrate the box in hotel suites, using real bills to create the illusion of money replication. The secret? He had hidden authentic bills inside the machine beforehand. By the time the marks realized the truth, that the box was nothing but wood, gears, and lies, Lustig was long gone. He raked in thousands, sometimes tens of thousands. And yet he stayed just under the radar. Until his name reached the ears of Chicago's most dangerous man, Al Capone. Capone, already king of the criminal underworld, had heard of Lustig's brilliance. Not many men dared to steal, let alone lie, to Capone. But Lustig was bold. He didn't want to scam Capone, not exactly. What he wanted was something more unusual, a test of his skill. He approached Capone with a proposal. He said he had a plan, an investment, that would double Capone's money in 60 days. He wasn't specific, and he didn't need to be. He radiated confidence. Capone, intrigued, handed over $50,000 in cash. Lustig took the money, placed it in a safe deposit box, and disappeared for 2 months. But here's where the twist comes in. He didn't touch the money. Not a dollar. 60 days later, he returned to Capone and said solemnly, "The deal fell through. I couldn't make it work. But here's your money. Every penny." Capone stared at him, stunned. He wasn't used to honesty, especially from con men. But Lustig's act of integrity disarmed him. Impressed, Capone rewarded Lustig's honesty with a $5,000 bonus. That was Lustig's con all along. He didn't want the 50 grand. He wanted Capone's trust, and just enough of his money to keep him funded and out of suspicion. It worked. But fame has a cost. The Eiffel Tower scam had made Lustig notorious in Europe. Now his growing fortune, mysterious persona, and trail of broken marks made him a target in America. And soon, he'd meet the man determined to bring him down, not with bullets, but with handcuffs. A man named Agent Peter Rubano. As Victor Lustig's reputation grew across America, so did the file bearing his name on the desk of federal agents. He had pulled off schemes in New York, Chicago, St. Louis, New Orleans, and Miami, all without being caught. Each time, the pattern was the same: luxury hotels, wealthy marks, a silver tongue, and a silent exit. He left behind victims too embarrassed to speak up, money that was untraceable, and an identity that shifted with each train ticket. But finally, the government had had enough. The man chosen to hunt Lustig down was Secret Service agent Peter Rubano, a sharp-eyed investigator from New York with a deep hatred for counterfeiters. At the time, the Secret Service's primary mission wasn't protecting presidents, it was protecting money. And Lustig's operations, especially those involving his fake money boxes, had grown too large to ignore. Rubano began gathering clues, testimonies from swindled businessmen, hotel records, anonymous tips, and hand-drawn sketches. The problem was, no one could describe Lustig the same way twice. To some, he was short. To others, tall. His hair color seemed to change. His accent shifted depending on the audience. He was a shapeshifter in a pinstripe suit. But Rubano had one advantage: patience. While Lustig moved from city to city, charming and cheating, Rubano quietly assembled a web of sightings, names, and transactions. He learned to follow not the man, but his pattern. Lustig always stayed in elegant hotels. He always paid in crisp bills. He always targeted the wealthy, never the poor. He wanted admiration as much as he wanted money. But even with Rubano's growing file, Lustig remained untouchable. Then came the break. A hotel manager in Chicago reported a mysterious guest, a well-dressed European gentleman who had paid cash for a suite, entertained numerous guests, and left town suddenly. The staff had found strange mechanical parts in his room. More importantly, a suitcase had been left behind. Inside were traces of engraving equipment and counterfeit bills. Rubano had his trail. He traced the bills to a counterfeit ring Lustig had built in St. Louis. It was more than a one-man operation now. Lustig had begun printing his own money, high-quality fakes that blended so seamlessly with the real thing that even trained cashiers couldn't spot them. The government considered it a direct threat to the U.S. economy. A full-scale manhunt began. Still, Lustig remained cool. He knew he was being followed. He changed hotels every few nights. He wore glasses, wigs, even fake facial scars. He altered his voice. He carried multiple passports. He paid in cash. He trusted no one but Dan Collins, his loyal partner, who always ran interference when needed. But one mistake would cost him. In 1935, after years of chasing shadows, Rubano caught a break. Lustig, operating under yet another alias, had wired a Western Union telegram to an associate. It was intercepted, and it included a hotel address in New York City. That was all Rubano needed. The very next morning, federal agents surrounded the hotel, and Rubano walked in. He found Lustig calmly reading a newspaper in the lobby, dressed in a tailored suit with a white carnation in his lapel. When Rubano approached and said, "You're under arrest, Victor," Lustig smiled, stood up politely, and nodded. He handed over his hat and said, "You got me, officer." But this wouldn't be the end. Not for a man like Victor Lustig. Victor Lustig was finally in custody. After years of playing hide-and-seek with governments across 2 continents, the con man who sold the Eiffel Tower, outwitted Al Capone, and duped banks with fake bills was caught. And yet, As Agent Peter Rubano escorted him out of the New York hotel, Lustig didn't look like a defeated man. He looked calm, collected, like a gentleman finishing an appointment. The Secret Service charged him with counterfeiting, the most serious crime under their watch. He was brought to jail in New York while authorities prepared the full case, one they hoped would land him in prison for life. The press loved it. Headlines screamed, "Famed counterfeiter nabbed!" Photos of Lustig, dapper as always, appeared on front pages. The public finally saw the face behind the myth. But what no one expected was that Lustig wasn't finished. On the surface, he played the part of a cooperative prisoner. He gave polite answers, never raised his voice, and behaved impeccably. But beneath that charm, he was watching, calculating, looking for cracks in the system. He found one. On September 1, 1935, just weeks before his trial, Lustig managed to escape from a federal detention facility in Manhattan. The details are still debated, but one version of the story is so audacious, it fits his legend perfectly. According to reports, Lustig fashioned a rope out of bedsheets, climbed out of a window several stories high, and vanished into the night. Some say he disguised himself as a guard. Others suggest he bribed someone on the inside. But one thing is certain, when the guards did their morning head count, Victor Lustig was gone. Chaos followed. The newspapers had a field day. "The man who sold the Eiffel Tower escapes!" screamed the headlines. The embarrassment for law enforcement was enormous. Agent Rubano was furious. He chased this man across a continent only to have him walk out the front door of justice. A manhunt launched instantly. The FBI and Secret Service scoured cities, ports, train stations. They contacted Interpol, suspecting Lustig might flee to Europe. But he didn't run far. He went to Pittsburgh. And he kept printing money. From a small rented room under a fake name, Lustig set up another counterfeiting operation. He was relentless. This time, he used newly designed bills and equipment. But the pressure was growing. The net was tightening. Rubano had already learned that Victor was never idle. If he was missing, he was up to something. The break came not from the federal agents, but from Dan Collins, Lustig's longtime partner. It's unclear why Collins turned. Some say it was over money. Others say he feared going down with Lustig. Whatever the reason, Collins gave up his location. On May 10, 1936, agents raided Lustig's hideout in Pittsburgh. They found him in the middle of a print run. Stacks of fake bills covered the room. A hidden compartment in the wall held forged plates. And there was Lustig again, dressed in a suit, hands raised, smiling slightly, as if to say, "Well played." This time, there was no smooth talking, no bribes, no fake documents. He was caught red-handed. Victor Lustig was tried in federal court in New York and sentenced to 20 years in Alcatraz, the infamous island prison designed to hold men exactly like him, unbreakable, untouchable, impossible to trust. But even in Alcatraz, he would leave behind a mystery or two. When the iron doors of Alcatraz slammed shut behind him in 1936, Victor Lustig wasn't just entering a prison, he was entering legend. Alcatraz was no ordinary place. It was a fortress of stone and sea, built on a lonely island in the San Francisco Bay. Surrounded by frigid waters and patrolled by armed guards, it was designed for the men who could not be held anywhere else. The escape artists, the gangsters, the men who outsmarted everyone. Lustig fit right in. He was now inmate number 300. His cell was small, cold, and unforgiving. No silk suits. No hotel lobbies. No sweet-talking wealthy victims over champagne. Just a metal bunk, a toilet, and 23 hours a day of confinement. Still, even in a place filled with killers and criminals, Lustig stood out. Other inmates respected him. He was polite, well-spoken, and impossibly calm. He didn't brag. He didn't complain. Some said he still carried himself like royalty, even in a prison uniform. The guards watched him carefully, not because he was violent, but because no one could quite believe he wouldn't try something. And maybe he did. Rumors spread among the inmates. Lustig was planning an escape. He was secretly building a raft. He was bribing a guard. He was faking illness. None of it was ever proven, but the story stuck, because with Victor Lustig, you never knew what was real. His time on Alcatraz was mostly quiet. He worked in the prison print shop. He filed appeals, all of which were denied. His health, slowly but surely, began to decline. Life behind bars wore him down in ways the outside world never could. The man who once walked among the elite, who dined in Paris, gambled in Vienna, and fooled Al Capone, now stood in line for meals, spoke only when spoken to, and stared at concrete walls. He kept a low profile, but his legend refused to die. Even while he sat behind bars, stories about his life continued to grow. Journalists tried to piece together his past. No two accounts matched. Was he a count? A war veteran? An orphan? A genius? A thief? Some believed he had hidden money across Europe. Others claimed he'd worked for foreign intelligence. The truth was always just out of reach, and that's how Lustig liked it. By 1947, Victor Lustig was a shadow of his former self. Years in prison had taken a toll on his body. He suffered from pneumonia and complications of meningitis. His once razor-sharp mind now drifted between clarity and confusion. On March 11, 1947, Victor Lustig died in a medical wing of a Missouri prison hospital, where he'd been transferred due to illness. He was 57 years old. The official cause, complications from the brain infection. His death went mostly unnoticed. A small note in the papers. No ceremony. No family by his side. But his legend? That lived on. In life, Lustig left behind few possessions. No fortune was ever recovered. No secret vault ever found. All that remained were the stories, told in whispers, written in court documents, and retold in books and films. The man who sold the Eiffel Tower had disappeared one final time. And in that vanishing act, he completed his greatest trick of all. He made the world remember him, not as a criminal, but as a myth. Victor Lustig didn't use force. He didn't steal in the night or hold a gun to anyone's head. His weapon of choice was far more dangerous: belief. Every one of his cons, from the bogus money printing box to the Eiffel Tower scam, relied on the same principle: people see what they want to see. He didn't trick fools. He tricked the greedy, the ambitious, the proud. He gave them just enough truth to lower their guard, and just enough mystery to keep them chasing the reward. He was never just lying. He was building a world where his lies felt more real than reality. He understood something most con men never did. The con wasn't about the trick. It was about the performance. He dressed like a diplomat, carried forged documents that looked more official than the originals, and spoke in a dozen accents. He could play the count, the banker, the civil servant, whatever the job required. And he rehearsed each role with the dedication of a stage actor. He didn't just lie, he became the lie. And his greatest asset? He never overplayed it. He didn't promise impossible returns or flaunt wealth. He made his victims feel like they were in on a secret. That they were part of something discreet, exclusive, elite. It was always a quiet deal, a limited opportunity, and always strictly confidential. That's why so many of his victims never came forward. Because to do so would mean admitting they'd been not only fooled, but seduced by their own greed. It wasn't just money they lost. It was pride. Lustig once famously wrote down the 10 Commandments for con men. Whether or not he truly authored the list is debated, but it's often attributed to him, and it captures the essence of his technique. Be a patient listener. Never look bored. Wait for the other person to reveal political opinions, then agree. Let the mark reveal religious views, then agree. Hint at sex talk, but don't follow up unless the mark shows interest. Never boast, just let your importance be quietly obvious. Never discuss illness unless it's relevant. Never pry into personal issues. They'll tell you eventually. Never name drop, just imply connections. Always be charming. Always. These weren't rules for criminals. They were rules for puppet masters. Victor Lustig lived by them. And he didn't just con wealthy businessmen and crooked politicians. He conned society itself, by creating a version of himself that people wanted to believe. But even the most elegant illusion can only last so long. In the end, the man behind the charm was still just a man, one who ran out of time, luck, and lies. But his blueprint? That lived on. Every con artist who came after him borrowed from his playbook. His scams were studied by law enforcement and imitated by fraudsters around the world. He may have died in prison, but his style and his story never did. Long after Victor Lustig's death in 1947, his name continued to drift through history like a ghost in a silk suit. He left behind no memoirs, no deathbed confessions, no last-minute revelations. And perhaps that's why his legend has endured, because the gaps in his story invite imagination. The details blur into myth. And what began as a life of deception became a story that feels almost too perfect to be true. Historians and journalists have tried for decades to separate fact from fiction. Some say he was born in Austria-Hungary, others claim Bohemia. He spoke 5 languages, or was it 6? He studied in elite schools, or maybe he learned everything on the streets. Even his real name is uncertain. Victor Lustig may have been just one of many aliases. But what remains undisputed is this: he was one of the most skilled con men to ever live. His greatest scam, selling the Eiffel Tower, has become the stuff of legend. But it wasn't just the audacity of the crime that amazed people. It was the execution. The way he read the room. The way he found the perfect mark. The way he vanished without a trace. He didn't just steal money, he stole belief. And even now, his story is told in financial crime courses, law enforcement training, and criminal psychology textbooks. Why? Because Lustig didn't rely on force or violence. He exposed something deeper: the human tendency to believe what we want to be true, especially when money is involved. And it wasn't just the Eiffel Tower. He ran phony banknote presses, swindled Al Capone, escaped federal custody, and operated across 2 continents during one of the most lawless eras in modern history. He wasn't just conning men, he was dancing circles around entire institutions. In the decades that followed, many tried to emulate him, but few ever came close. His life had that perfect blend of charisma, risk, timing, and discipline. He didn't rely on brute force or blind luck. He planned, he prepared, and most of all, he performed. Yet, despite all the drama, his final years were quiet. No daring escape from Alcatraz. No buried fortune discovered after his death. Just a slow fade into obscurity, ending in a prison hospital bed far from the glamour and smoke-filled rooms of Paris. And maybe that's fitting. Because for all his showmanship, Lustig was a man who thrived in disappearance. In vanishing just before the trick was revealed. In leaving behind questions without answers. Mysteries without endings. Even today, no one knows exactly how much money he made. No vault was ever found. No offshore accounts uncovered. If there was a fortune, it vanished with him. Or maybe, just maybe, it never existed. Maybe that too was part of the performance. Because when you're Victor Lustig, the greatest illusion is not the one you sell, it's the one you leave behind. And his final illusion? That a man who never belonged to any country, any system, or any name, became immortal by doing the one thing no one believed could be done. He sold the Eiffel Tower. And people still talk about it. Victor Lustig didn't leave behind statues or medals. There's no museum dedicated to his life, no holiday in his honor, no official acknowledgement of the genius that once walked among diplomats and gangsters, dressed in the same tailored suit. But for those who study deception, those who understand how delicate and dangerous trust can be, Lustig is remembered as the master of the long game. And perhaps that's the best place for his memory to live, not in marble, but in stories. Because what Victor Lustig truly sold wasn't metal or fake machinery. What he sold, over and over again, was possibility. The idea that something too good to be true just might be real. That a machine might print real money. That a tower might quietly be up for sale. That you, and only you, had the inside track. He sold dreams. And dreams, when they crash, always leave a bruise. To this day, economists, criminologists, and behavioral scientists still point to Lustig's life as a case study in persuasion and manipulation. He understood how people think, how power feels, and how confidence, real or fake, can move mountains. Or in his case, sell landmarks. But more than that, his story is a reflection of the world he lived in. A world recovering from war, hungry for wealth, dazzled by technology, and blinded by greed. He didn't create that world. He just navigated it better than anyone else. And he did it with elegance. Lustig never carried a gun. He never ran a mob. He rarely raised his voice. He won with conversation, posture, and silence. In an era of roaring excess and explosive crime, he was the quiet one, the man in the corner who could talk you into handing over your fortune with a smile on your face. He was also a man of contradictions. He scammed without remorse, yet never resorted to cruelty. He built relationships only to walk away from them. He lived richly, yet died alone. His name is etched into history, but the details of his life remain a fog, just the way he would have liked it. And while the world has changed, while cybercrime and surveillance now rule the game, the heart of a Khan remains the same: trust, twisted into a weapon. Lustig didn't invent that, but he perfected it. So when you hear the story of Victor Lustig, the man who sold the Eiffel Tower, don't just see a criminal. See the magician behind the curtain. The man who taught the world that the greatest trick isn't getting someone to believe a lie, but getting them to want to believe it. And that, more than anything, is why Victor Lustig still matters. Because in a world full of noise, he whispered a lie, and the world leaned in to hear it. And that was the incredible, improbable story of Victor Lustig, the man who turned lies into legend and sold a national monument with nothing more than confidence and forged paperwork. If this story surprised you, hit like, subscribe, and share your favorite part in the comments below. We post news stories every week, perfect for curious minds, quiet nights, and learning while you sleep. Thanks for listening. Sleep well, stay sharp, and we'll see you in the next one.